And welcome to my lecture on grid-based modeling 101, kind of an introduction to both the G-range and SAVANNA landscape models. I'm Greg Kiker. I'm a professor in ag and bioengineering. Let's get right to it. Okay, so an overview of this talk would be effectively, full disclosure, I'm not an ecologist. I don't even play one on TV. So if you have ecological questions, best to ask a landscape ecologist. I'm an engineer who models landscape systems. So on the modeling side, certainly happy to answer questions. On the ecology side, I always default to my ecological friends. What we are going to talk about are grid-based landscape models and how they see a complex biological world. And we're going to talk about SAVANNA, the original everything bagel model. It's got a little of everything in it. It's had a lot of stuff in it since the 1990s. And we'll talk about G-range, which is a model that was created from elements of the SAVANNA model by Dr. Randy Boone at Colorado State, which I use a lot of and have a great admiration for. So yeah, we're going to talk about them both because once you've learned one, you can learn them both. And I think they're both excellent models for what they do. Also, Randy Boone didn't stop there. At Colorado State, he made the DECUMA model, which is an agent-based agro-pastoralist model that can link with either G-range or SAVANNA. So it's an excellent model if you want to put humans into a landscape. So I'm going to talk about a little of each of these models, but again, if you want to know more, happy to talk to you offline at your convenience. Secrets of success, you got to take the stuff in parts. Trying to grab it all at once can be a little overwhelming, but I often describe SAVANNA as a group of simple models that make a complex model together. And also find a community of users. We're trying to make one among Colorado State and Randy Boone's group, my group, and anybody else who wants to join. So if you have interest, let's form something that we can help each other. So basic information on the kind of G-range, SAVANNA, and DECUMA models. The best actual kind of book on SAVANNA is actually a recently put out book, Natural Resource Management Reimagined by Woodman, Seymour, and Ojima and Richards out of the Colorado State Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory. It's a great book, has kind of everything they've been doing, and SAVANNA's within that world, talked about it a lot. G-range has its own history and set of some really nice journal articles on this that talk about it. Also, G-range is already fully open source and out there. I'm putting in the red, you see the GitHub address, so you can download it, start working on it right away. DECUMA has a couple of really nice journal articles and book chapters, and there's more coming as well from Randy and his group. And also I'm trying to get out a paper as well. So there'll be some more and more great stuff with DECUMA to let you know also. So some key technical concepts, SAVANNA, G-range, L-range. You'll see me sometimes say G-range or L-range. The G-range is the global range model. L-range is a local version of that, but effectively it's the same model being run at a local scale. So SAVANNA, G-range, L-range, and DECUMA are all written in Fortran or Fortran 90. And so I've got some lectures on code blocks in G-Fortran and using that with the models. Those are free systems so you, even if you're not a Fortran person, Fortran is great for moving numbers around very quickly. It doesn't do great with user interfaces or graphics, but it does move numbers like a dragster. So that's why we're using it. They're all written in that, so we're going to use it. But we're not going to talk about it today. What advantages you can run on a laptop quite quickly. Even a large application can be run on your laptop. Or if you want to port that to a supercomputer, we've done that as well. So the advantage of Fortran is it does run quickly on lots of platforms. They all use GIS grids as inputs, mostly in the ASCII or ADRISI or other format that you may be familiar with. So again, something that you can really work with because a lot of us are already working with GIS or remote sensing grids, and these can really form the inputs to some of your models. All are committed to open source and sharing. So yes, ask around. And I'm setting myself up as a resource, but other folks like Randy are also available to answer questions. There are some old user interfaces available for both models, but really most of us are using R scripts to both create inputs and process outputs. So most of the outputs you'll see today are usually done through another program, either through GIS or through R scripts more and more, or Python scripts for that matter. Looking at SAVANNA as a connected group, this is kind of a schematic of the entire model. You won't see any equations here, but we will talk about different parts. And again, it has a vegetation and soil submodel. It has plant population and primary productivity and light interception, along with a pretty good water balance operating at usually a weekly time step. But there's a herbivores in this system too. So it's basically simulating some nice processes in terms of herbivore distribution, population dynamics. So you can have births and deaths. You can find out an energy balance of whether they ate enough. You can even look at what they ate through the herbivory function. And if you want predators in there, eating herbivores, you can have those as well. You can have culling within it. You can have people, weather, fire, and soil. So there's a lot of great information. So it's a process-based model operating at a weekly time step embedded into a gridded landscape. So usually you end up putting in soils, topography, vegetation, maps, usually in grid form. And it takes the world and divides it up into grids. And so they are spatially explicit. What size grid, you may ask? Well, it's what you decide. I've seen people run 30-meter grids through SAVANNA or G-range all the way up to kilometers. I've run 10 square kilometers or even higher for the global rangeland model. But the world is divided up into grids, but you're not limited by that. Actually, within SAVANNA, you can actually take a grid and divide it up into areas and sub-areas. So you can divide grids topologically, and you can also divide them in terms of patches, both woody, shrubby, and grass-dominated patches. And then next, you can also, so what effectively the model does is it will basically turn all those different combinations into point simulations that it will then simulate and then scale back up into the grids. So effectively, it's cheating. It gives you both spatial and point-based simulations, which again can be very useful. So if you're thinking about the key SAVANNA concepts that I want to talk to you in this intro lecture, you have to decide on a grid scale. What is the primary spatial unit of calculation or reference? You have to have the same size. So it is a regular grid, not an irregular grid. And the grids don't change size or position within a simulation. Within a grid, you can name things called sub-areas. And sub-areas are really useful because they can be topologically oriented. So they can be runoff or run-on areas. They can be part of a hill slope like crests, mid-slope, foot slopes, and stream beds. They're represented as a percentage of the grid. And here's the most important thing. Sub-areas do not change in size during a simulation. They are set, but it allows you to have, let's say, a different soil system on your crest sub-area versus your stream beds, which might have a lot more clay. And you can also put different vegetation groupings in those sub-areas. So it gives you the ability within a grid to simulate different configurations of soil and vegetation. But that's not all. Within a sub-area, so within the crest area or the runoff area, you can delineate 3 different facets. So this is what they call facets. They're non-spatial again, but they're proportions. But these can change, and they're vegetation related. So you get 3 types of facets, usually grass-dominated ones, which assumes that the grass is the primary dominant vegetation of that little area. You can have tree-dominated areas that are trees. Funny enough, you can have trees, shrubs, and grass in tree-dominated areas, but it's effectively forest or maybe tree savanna. You can even have shrub-dominated areas. So if you're out west in the United States, you could have a juniper, a shrub that comes in and takes over. You could have a shrub-dominated landscape as well. And these facets shrink and swell. They change during a simulation. So that's what makes them so a great advantage, is this idea that they can change. And again, you can mix and match these to what you like. This is important because it gives you a huge amount of freedom within a spatial landscape to name things that don't change over a simulation, like soils or topology, and things that do change. Things like, oh, woody patches or grass areas. And if you put a fire through, it might literally, take out some woody patches and put in more grassy or shrub dominated patches. So you have a lot of dynamism within this design of a model, and it's really quite nifty. SAVANNA Outputs, which is really nice. They usually can get weekly or monthly outputs. The internal time step of SAVANNA is weekly. It's doing 7 days of growth and rainfall and stuff. So it's not a daily model, but usually it's internal time steps a week, but usually we're putting out monthly output, and it can put out maps in the form of grids. They can be different types, whether they're Esri or ASCII grids. Usually that's what we're defaulting to, because you can read them with R scripts or Python scripts. It also puts out time series files, usually in the CSV format, comma separated values. It also does reports as well, if you like it to kind of give an ASCII text. And then of course we can make some R generated graphs, but that's separate to the model itself. So we're effectively running the model, then we're running R to create this bar chart, or this box and whiskers chart to the right here that I made from some DECUMA output. We'll show that later. But here in this picture, you can see a typical map that it created. That's cattle density for a month in Ethiopia. Then there's a time series that happened over that, represented as just a long simulation over time. And then there's actually, you can do more with it with the box plots, or the bar box and whiskers parts with some of the agent modeling, or you can do it with some of these spatial data. Where has it been used? Well, gravy. All this stuff has been used a lot of places. It was born in Africa in the Turkana project in Kenya. It's been run from Ngorongoro, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, lots of times in South Africa for myself and some of my colleagues at the University of Florida, and some group at Wageningen as well. Mozambique, we've been playing with some stuff. Also in North America, we've got around Elk Island. Yellowstone National Park has been 1990s and early 2000s. There's been some other ones, Devil's Tower National Monument, and the Pryor Mountain Wild Horse Range as well. Also, there's some stuff in Australia and even Mongolian savanna runs. So again, where are we working with right now? My group is working with Kruger National Park. We've got a huge amount. I did my PhD work there. We're running Kruger at 5 km, and we're developing a very detailed 1 km grid. I'm dreaming of making a Kukui and Pelosi park version. That's what I call it, version 0, which means we're working on getting it spun up. But we have the data and we're building that. There's been some early runs for Serengeti National Park, but it needs expanded migration code. We've got a version running in Okavango in the Chobe Lanyati area. Impala Research Station, we've been trying to build up some stuff there. Gorongosa National Park, I've got a working version that we're tuning in. It's got predators and all kinds of vegetation dynamics. I promised folks in South Africa that we'd do Atala Game Reserve as well. That's a fun rhino elephant area in KwaZulu-Natal. We've got some runs going right now in Canada for Elk Island National Park, fully working, and we're looking for collaborations. And we've talked about some other parks as well. I've done some livestock work in Nkai District in Zimbabwe, and also the Dire region of Borana of southern Ethiopia. So we'll talk just a few of these. But if you have any interest in some of these zones, or you want to propose some new areas, let me know, because I'm always looking for a new place to try to run these models. So pitch us and we'll see what we can make together. So this is just an idea of what SAVANNA is doing in the KMP. This is actually the Kruger National Park in South Africa at 5 km grids. So the SAVANNA configuration was done by the Tembo project originally. Mike Kogenauer built it from different people's runs, my own PhD runs in Kruger, and a few other people, Randy Boone's runs from Ngorongoro Crater. And so then this has been published, and I can send you these articles. Yellow Hilbers, Aaron Bunting, and Tim Folman did some really nice work with SAVANNA. 5 km grids, you get about 750 here. Weekly time step, about 17 years of historical simulation, actually more than that now. We run about till 2020. And then GCM-based future climates. So we took it all the way to there. Then you have the trace changing facets like we talked about, the grass, shrub, tree dominated areas. There's fire that you can both put historical maps in there, or you can have, and then they're auto simulated by the model. And herbivore populations for this version, the 5 km, we have surveys that we're putting in. 10 different types of plants, 3 grasses, 1 shrub, 6 different tree groups that you can see, and I'm more than happy to go into the details, but we'll talk a bit more about those ahead. And also, if you want to get offline, we can talk a lot about the different parts of these. 6 different herbivores, though yellow Hilbers, I think, had 10 to 12 in his 2015 paper. Actually, it should be 2015 yellow Hilbers. And again, outputs of interest, usually time series and grids. And again, we looked at elephant population across some zones. So these were management zones, these here, zone 1 through 4. And then we were looking at how different vegetation would impact, how did elephants impact across these? And you could look at, one of the advantages of working inside the Kruger, of course, is that they had a lot of data that you could look at and put on top of each other and start to look at the different woody data sets, different grass data sets. There's some different remote sensing data sets, and we were looking at model calibration and testing across these periods. And again, usually SAVANNA and these different groups it's easier and easier to find data now that you usually set up for the model, and you can check against different pattern-oriented modeling and different ways of validating the model. So this is just a typical kind of set of eye candy runs. This is elephants for every month. Just to give you an idea of what the model outputs looks like if you animate it. This is some simulated elephant populations expanding and changing with the different wet seasons, and it's okay. I think I could do better now. This is just an old animation I created, so don't hold me to it, but it gives you an idea of what it tends to look like. This is a vegetation. This is a green biomass, I believe, through the Kruger. Just, you can see the different effects of the seasons and different rains. And again, spatially explicit. So you have some areas growing a lot, some areas not growing a lot. And again, you could do this this was just a couple of years for example. You can do a lot more. You can also get time series runs. This is the Shannon-Weiner biomass index that is running, that SAVANNA puts out. And then you can look at elephant populations during the same time to see if there's within these different zones. So again, it took all the output from zone 4 and put it into a time series. You can also compare that to whether elephant populations had an effect on this, which they really didn't that much. You see them quite regular. And of course, there are some of the publications that you can get to, and I'm happy to share them with you as well. If you look at the vegetation and soil submodels, this will just be a couple of quick pictures with this. You can effectively, SAVANNA simulates biomass creation from photosynthesis, like a crop model, if you're knowing those, but it allows multiple types of plant species living and competing within the same space. That is, you can have different types of grasses fighting it out with light interception from a shrub on top of it, and trees the same way. This allows a simulation of biomass and canopy cover. So you can also get populations, you can get biomass, and you can get cover, which is really nice. So you can do a lot, grass and shrubs and trees, or functional groups. So if you have specific interest in a certain type of grass species, like palatable grasses, like Themata triandra, or some other grasses, you could put those in and start to look at how different species react with different herbivore pressures. And again, it does give you both horizontal and vertical outputs. You can say, well, give me the tree cover over time for tree cover in a grid or an area between 2 and 3 meters. So again, it's quite nice for that. In trees in SAVANNA, you get 6 different size classes that the users put together. You define them, and again, we have parameter sets for acacia, vachellia species groups, and we have lots of different ones. Combretums, we have a fair amount of parameters for that we're quite happy with. Parameters are named about each size. You can get some stem heights and diameters. You can define them either allometrically, or you can use your own data if you've got it. Many of them have, again, we've got lots of parameter sets. Usually we take some existing parameter sets, and then you can make tweaks to what you think would make it work best for you. Same thing with shrubs. We've got those too. Grasses are a little simpler. They don't have the 6 size classes. They do pretty much just a biomass and a cover. So again, they're a little simpler because, of course, having to chase down size classes for grasses would be quite difficult. Let's take a quick look at herbivores and herbivore submodels within SAVANNA. So again, looking at SAVANNA simulates herbivore physiology, population dynamics, and their distribution across the landscape. There are simple and complex options for simulating herbivore dynamics. So you can decide whether you want to go with a simple energy balance and simple distribution, or if you really want to get down and detailed, you can start to look at some more of the fancy algorithms that were developed by others. Again, you can look at yearly demographic groups with mature male females, immature male females, and calf groupings. Usually it's simulating different groups of your herbivores, so you can see whether the calving, did they have many babies that year? Was it good or bad? You could relate stress if you want. And you can put in specific herds if you need correct geographic coverage of herds, or you can kind of turn them loose and let them wander the landscape, whichever you wish. Within the weather fire world, how do you do climate and fire? Well, effectively, Savannah can either use a single weather station, usually of monthly output, monthly inputs, but wanting to actually, you can either put in a grid of monthly values, or you can put in just some stations, and it can even interpolate between stations if you wish. We have a lot of R scripts for running this now. We usually sample chirps data, which is okay, but you don't get a lot. You get a lot of smoothed data. You don't get a lot of, if you have really good point data, then you may want to use it and let Savannah try to interpolate between. You can actually now look at the differences between the two rainfall estimates. So for some places, you can get quite good rainfall, like the Kruger Park. Savannah can read fire maps as inputs, or you can simulate combustion intensity and spread from actually 2 or 3 different internal options. I've used Vanevsky, the model, which is inside Savannah, which has been pretty good. It actually does a pretty good job of combustion intensity and return period for fire. So you can look at flame heights within it. It's quite nice, and it's quite easy to use. Different predators and culling. So what do you do with predators and people? Well, you can add virtual fencing, so you can push herbivores into specific locations if you're herding cattle or wanting to look at management options. You can look at systematic removal of herbivores via culling. So it has several algorithms, either via hunting or population controls. Predators are available in the model. They're done with the Mark Boyce's wolf model, which is out there, and I can provide the literature for that. If you want detailed humans, you got to put in DECUMA, because they're the ones that actually have households on the landscape. But again, I've got the predator model working as well, and it works pretty well. You can start to look at it. I've tuned it up for lions and wild dog and all kinds of stuff, but there's some really good wolf parameters for those working in North America. And again, there's the actual two Boyce and Galliard models. Mark Boyce was the one who developed it. So again, out there, and I can take you through that code as well. Okay, so that was Savannah. Now let's simplify it, and let's make G-range the global. Again, this was source material by Randy Boone, and I just did some editing. G-range came from the world that if you want to do a huge amount of area, Savannah needs too much. So Randy Boone simplified it and really combined Savannah with the Century model, and he created a global range model. So he captures mostly primary production and its dynamics. It's a tool of moderate complexity, so it doesn't need as much as Savannah does. One very good, and theoretically, I do believe him that it takes about a week to learn the model. It's not hard to get it running, but it's a lot to actually understand. But it is within a single executed process. It can do the whole world in one process, and it's pretty doggone fast too. Very simple kind of code structure. It runs fast on almost everyone's computer. So it's really quite nice. Again, a monthly time step. It's gridded, but there you'll start to see that they sacrifice a little bit of the detail that Savannah has so that you can get a global perspective. It still does grass, shrubs, and trees, but it doesn't give you multiple species. Now you pretty much just get one grass, one shrub, one tree. You can still make it a different type of grass for African savannas versus Arctic tundra. So you can, but you will have one grass. And so he allows you to change your parameters according to the grids or to vegetation zones, but you get a grass. It's just representative of the whole thing. The ability of proportions, they still change over time, which is really nice. So you can have shrub encroachment, or the trees can slowly take over. Or if you have a lot of fire, you can keep the woody plants at bay. But the advantage of G-range is you can start to really run long simulations, and you can do it over huge areas. The ability to include natural and management modifications, so you can do grazing and fire and fertilization. It allows you to do that, but you don't get the herbivore detail. That is, you don't get the physiology, you don't get the distributions. You can put herbivores in a grid, but it's a lot more simplified. So if effectively, I always put this equation, G-range is parts of savanna plus the century model. So how does G-range see the world? Well, this is a typical kind of G-range. This is, I think, 55 square kilometer grids, still pretty detailed. Again, about 50 square kilometers, 0.5 degrees. So they did the whole world. And of course, you're not doing the oceans, and you don't have to do every grass, you don't have to do the desert, Sahara desert. So you can pick which areas have it. You can start to set up these landscape units, divides them up into, but each grid is effectively one type of area that has grass, shrubs, and trees in it. So the area that is in Africa and savanna can be parameterized differently than the North American Western states. So again, it does give you some freedom, but it's still taking a global perspective. So if we're using the same cartoon, G-range takes things, still puts them into grids, still they get like the 0.5 by 0.5 degree, but now you're just putting in, you have the facets. So he doesn't have the sub areas, right? We just have one type of area, but you can still have shrub, grass, and trees within that area, but you only get one woody plant, one shrubby plant, and one grass, but the areas that they dominate can change. So you can still do bush encroachment, you can still do shrub encroachment versus tree encroachment, you can do the effective fires or grazing, so still very useful. What you also get, well, these are parameter files, and then you also have the century model for water and nutrients. So you can do detailed long-term carbon, you can look at nitrogen, you can look at a lot of outputs that century gives you, but you get more management and spatial delineation, which is quite handy. So what else does it have? Well, G-range, water, nutrients are all done effectively like the century model. So they have a fast, intermediate, and passive carbon pools, and the century model is a well set up model by Bill Parton and the group back in 1993 that's available even now, but G-range puts a lot more detail of the surface on that model. So again, it's a really nice combination of models that can give you quite a lot of long-term carbon storage. Plants can still compete for water, nutrients, light, and space, and you get a lot of biogeochemical and population changes, especially to the plants. So less about the animals, more about the plants. But you get more than 100 surfaces are produced by G-range each monthly time step. So pretty much all G-range does is give you maps on the monthly time step. Now, what type of maps? Well, before it gives you maps, I'll talk about, there's a user interface that's out there that you can use, that you can do some visualization, that it will turn it into different types of facets. Oops, excuse me. And you can look at the time series that come from that. And I know that Randy is writing some more in Python as well. This is, I forget what language this is in, but it's available to you if you wish it. I think the G-range GUI is out there. The simulations can do, again, we did when we ran this, and I'm running this a set of 1951 to 2070 rules that we did for that. And again, we've been running some of rerunning Randy's runs that he put into his 2017 model. And this is just some outputs for that come from that. You have the net primary production each year. You have the herbaceous annual net primary production. You can look at the changes over time with respect to different climate change scenarios. And this, again, is well covered in this modeling global change biology with Randy Boone and the group did in 2018. I encourage you to look at that, but we've been recreating some of these maps and they're really quite useful. And we've been expanding on this work as well. What Randy did that was really quite nice within that paper is he's looking at basic primary productivity. And we've been looking at this even from a country level. He broke it into kind of these large zones. We've been knocking it into more local, like what is happening at a national level within countries in Africa. But again, there's some, of course, depending on where you live and what kind of climate you have, there may be wins or losses with each. And again, I'd point you to Randy's excellent paper to go over the details. So this is one of our simulations. This is what that looks like for our Africa runs that we're doing for the USDA ERS right now, where we're taking this and really looking at Africa in high detail. And this is just some very typical simulations that we're doing for just the grass areas. in Africa. So you're not having to do every part. It actually, you can mask out what you don't want. But again, you can have a lot of different zones in here. And this is just some of the zones we're simulating globally that can be brought to bear within this within the simulation. And happy to talk over the details of these, but for argument's sake, I'm going to move on. Things to remember. Remember that even if I blew up this area just to kind of show people, remember that even inside every grid that that G range is doing, it still has the 3 facets. So every square that you see, you'll have actually information on the grass dominated areas, the shrub dominated areas, and the tree dominated areas. And the facets are simulated separately, so you can look at how a grass cover changes over time. You can also look at the carbon, the nitrogen, and other dynamics. You get this every month and by facet. So if you want to look at what happened to the carbon level in the grass and that grid in the grass dominated areas, you can get an idea of that. But you can even look at the grass within the shrub areas, because even within the shrub dominated zones, there is grass growing under the shrubs, and even in the tree areas. So again, it gives you some nice mixtures that you can look at. This is a list of all the things you can get. And this isn't even the full list, because every time you can just pause my voice and start looking through the different outputs. Every single one of these comes out as a map every month. So you can go from everything from your melt, if you have snow, all the way to burned carbon or burned nitrogen. I'm just looking at the beginning and the end of the list. Whenever something says facets in parentheses, that means you have 3 of those. Let's look at in the 3rd column at the top, dead standing nitrogen facets means you can have 3 maps, the dead standing nitrogen in the grass dominated areas versus the dead standing nitrogen in the shrub dominated areas, or the dead standing nitrogen in the tree dominated areas. So you get an idea of what kind of fire hose you get with this data. That's why I give you the picture of the fire hose in the background. You have to be ready. Now you can pick and choose. You can ignore all but one map over time if you wish, but this is what's available to you. And it's really, really quite simple to get to and to look at. Quite exciting. So summarizing, G-Range allows fast and global simulations. It's an integrated landscape and human process model. It has simple grid structure, but its execution allows potential linkage with other models, like we're going to talk about with DECUMA. And it is fully open source, and it has non-proprietary tools. So you can get started on this right away. Now we're just building a community so that you won't be working alone. References here, the primary ones are the ones that I've done, but there's some really good stuff. And there is a website that Randy set up that I think that has some great information on it as well. Okay, finally, the last part. Trying to get human populations inside here. And I'm going to show you a model that's SAVANNA and G-Range with human populations. I'm going to show you a specific one working with both, well, SAVANNA and G-Range are primarily soil vegetation herbivore models, but you want people in there too, because people in SAVANNA ecosystems have been together for a long, long time. And so, we need to keep the people in there too. So enter the DECUMA model, and I should know what DECUMA stands for. It is an acronym, but I don't remember what it stands for. I'm sure it's in the paper that Randy set up. But it's an agent-based model to put the humans back in the landscape. And here's the first paper. He did this for 2011, but there's more stuff going on right now. And I think there's a very nice community working with this model. This is some work that we did with SAVANNA and DECUMA working together in the Dire region of Ethiopia. So we're looking at resilient pastoral livestock systems. So we're not working with elephants, we're working with people and their livestock within Ethiopia. We're looking at resilience. And this, again, we have many more slides with this, but I'm not going to show them today. I'm just going to give you a taste of what this does. So we talk about the world. So this is in the Dire region of extreme southern Ethiopia. You can see that little red dot up in the upper corner, the left corner. That's where we're simulating. And then if you go to the blow up map here with the villages and the rivers and the roads and the kabeles, every little teeny grid you see, every little square that you see is a kilometer. So we ran SAVANNA at a kilometer level We're in the DIRA in the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia in Ubello and the Parano zone of Oromia. And again, this just gives you an idea. It's a mixed savanna with grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees. It's an agro-pastoralist system, so there's not no wildlife here, but they do have cattle, small stock, and camel. They grow teff, and the big question is policy and grazing reforms. How could seasonal access either help? Does it make a difference? So this was funded work by Trinity Senda of the University of Nairobi when she had a fellowship from ILRI. And then the German DAD Fund and the CG Center also provided support for this project. And so we looked at this. This was a project that we ended up working with, a system that's been under many different droughts over the years. It's had some crop and production area increases because people recover out of a drought, and then people moved in and settlement came in. The livestock populations over this time went from high cattle to higher goat populations. And this is just some cartoons to show every time you see an upside down cow was a big die off, and then they would recover. And you see this kind of pulsing effect of large scale die offs and slow recoveries. And then you slowly see goats taking over because, well, why? Well, maybe we could look into that with the model, which we did. There used to be pastoralist areas. They used to have wet and dry season mobility, but then everybody stuck around to the permanent water after a while and stayed because there was water. And so what was the effect of that? Plus there were livestock sales and cattle prices rising and falling. So again, there was this idea, and the vegetation itself changed from a grass dominated system to a woody and shrub dominated system. So there's some really great work by Trinity Senda and Lance Robinson at ILRI when he was there. And so I point you to some of the papers that they've done on looking at and some of the data they took locally before we modeled it. And so this was SAVANNA and DECUMA working together. So SAVANNA would run the ecosystem responses and climate and herbivory. And then DECUMA would actually simulate human actions on landscape. And this was a great model that it's almost like two engines in a car working together. The models would run, and each week SAVANNA would hand DECUMA a map of the ecosystem, and then DECUMA would decide what the humans would do and where they put their cows, and then they would eat, and then they'd hand that back to SAVANNA, which would then model what just happened with the humans. And so back and forth each week, these models would talk to each other with maps. They would hand them back and forth, and so they run together through time. And again, quite a nifty system, one of the most complex models, but again, really cool on what it could make. And so we also looked at pastoral grazing, open access, but we also made climate changes, increases in temperatures and CO2 concentrations. Just to give you an idea of kind of an overview, the different maps together. Again, we looked at cattle density, time series, and some household agent maps, because DECUMA is an agent-based model. It actually is doing 250 households across time. Our grid size was 1 kilometer squared. We did communal stocking rates. We simulated 250 households with DECUMA, with their livestock and crops, and we did about 38 years. And so, of course, the outputs are grids, time series, but the DECUMA model puts out household-based maps. It also has budgets of food, finance, and livestock over time. And so we're building a paper from this. Hopefully it'll be out by the time you can read this or hear this. So the results in brief just gives you an idea of what we looked at. SAVANNA, we had about 300 meg of data per run. So you have a lot of R scripts looking at livestock resilience, human resilience, and ecosystem resilience. This is just an idea of the tropical livestock units. Up in the top, you see it says open access. That means cows were everywhere all the time, all at once, all the time. And then on the lower one, you see this managed access area that has wet and dry, where we're pushing the cows across this landscape depending on the white. And of course, you could start to see where under the all year livestock, pretty stable system, though you do see some winds. This is all the tropical livestock units across all the different households. But you do see the difference when you start to manage the grazing back to the older system that really utilized the landscape better. You had better outcomes. You were able to put more TLUs on the land, and even the variations were increased. So quite a lot of difference in the simulations by just moving the cows around, or the livestock, cows, sheep, and goats. You can also look at the happiness. This is a condition index. So you see the little happy face up in there. That means if a cow is super happy, it means it got enough to eat. That means it has a condition index that varies from 0 to 1, meaning if it's 1, that cow is in cow nirvana. It's so happy. And if it's at 0, then it's pretty much near death. And so these are actual box plots of the open access brown box on top between cattle and goats, and then also the seasonal access. You can start, I'm just going to draw a line through them so you can see the happiness. Pretty much cows are not very happy in the system, and there's a big problem later on in the year 30 with this. Goats do a lot better, and you can start to see why people move to goats. They do better, but they still crash hard. If you manage the grazing, that was under open access grazing. If you actually take the cattle and put seasonal access, you still have quite a large variation due to climate, but you tend to do better. And you can see that you actually do have better outcomes, but still not perfect outcomes over time. So managed grazing is giving you a bit of better performance out of your rangelands, especially when you start to look at whether the different livestock are getting enough to eat within the landscape. So of course, you can say, we can look at the results and what about the grass biomass? Since this is an area that people care a lot about the grass, you can start to see that the benefits of managed access are greater in higher rainfall years. We'll talk a bit about that by looking at the maps. And again, moving grazing pressure around, it does help in certain times. So again, we found that but there was a systematic reduction in palatable species. We'll talk about that. So what we found was, this is open grazing on the left. That is, you see the little cartoon and it says open access. Effectively, in a good year, you can see the difference now. This is the same scale. The colors are the same, but during a good rainfall year, you have much better grazing availability in January and February and March due to your access. Now, this is in a good rainfall year. So effectively, SAVANNA and DECUMA showed that when you manage good grazing, you get a benefit in the good years. But it was quite interesting that what happens if you have a bad year? Well, this is just to show you the difference between a good year, that the managed grazing has a big effect versus open access on the left. In a bad year, there's not that much difference between the different groups, meaning the good grazing management only has effects in good and normal years, but in a bad year, it's always bad. So again, quite different than just relating it to a simple, really it's a complex system. So of course, there are complex results that come. Looking at the ecosystem resilience, well, funny enough, you actually, these two different plots look remarkably similar. Now, this is interesting because, of course, while you get better livestock outputs from managed grazing, you don't get a good result in the end. Matter of fact, the unpalatable grasses look almost identical. And so what SAVANNA and DECUMA kind of came up with was managed grazing access prolonged livestock production, but still degraded the ecosystem. So we're doing more runs to see if there are ways of having everything, which is good livestock, but without having to wreck your system as you go, and having low palatable grasses and woody encroachment as your end result. So interesting, you can have some winning areas, but also the output can be quite complex. And again, that's what you get from these models, is complexity. And the stories are seldom all good or all bad. So the key messages is that we're through this as we're publishing is that there are some different benefits to having managed grazing, but there's also some challenges that come from that. And we're going to cover this separately. And this was more just to show you how the models work when you're getting them all running together and looking at these complex agroecological systems between the vegetation and the people and the livestock or the herbivores in these systems. So the way forward, and I'm just about to finish, is there are models for each of your interests. If you want to go global or national scales, then G-range is probably your best option. We're actually taking G-range and tying it in with an economics model, the GTAP, with our USDA project, cooperative project, that we're looking at this different aspects of change in GDP that comes from the different percent and changes in land-based biomass, especially with respect to grass and trees. But you can also, if you have more interest in local scale models, you can run SAVANNA, where you can start to put in the world of your. So again, I always tell people, if you have a big, large area, you're going to use G-range. And if you have a lot of interest about a smaller area, you may use SAVANNA. So again, so what next? So you've gone through this whole thing. Thanks for keeping up with this. But there is free stuff available. The models are freely available. There are configurations you can have, and I'm happy to help you set something up for your interesting area. There's model source and code that's available to you. There's R scripts and Python code if you want it. You can develop your own. What we ask is, if you develop anything, you cough it up to the group, pay it forward, just like we're giving it to you. So we're all going to share stuff. And I think that's the best example. I am developing some open online courses, hopefully through GitHub on landscape modeling, but I'm also offering UF courses as well, more formal at the summer C. So I have a landscape modeling course in the summer C semester, and then agent-based modeling and decision risk analysis in summer B. But again, we're going to use these open SAVANNA sites as examples. So this initiative is something people will join because they want to get to the modeling of it, and there is support available. Certainly looking at collaboration mechanisms. Graduate students, how about a paper or a chapter within a PhD, or postdoc professionals or managers? Maybe we could build it in part of a funding proposal. But again, don't let that stop you. I'd rather help you and get you running, then we can decide what, the best mechanisms by which going on. If you're interested in kind of playing along, then give me an email, and I'll be happy to talk with you about it. Thanks so much. And if you have any questions, I think you'll just email me at this point. But thanks so much for your time.